This is no doubt a hot topic among Christians and Jews alike. Many will see Isaiah chapter 53 and they will attribute this to Jesus. And understandably so, because most people see Jesus as fitting the bill because of the persecution and the suffering that he took place in those Gospels. There's no doubt about that. But I want to show you a fresh perspective that both Christian and Jew alike will appreciate. Most Jews today will vehemently disregard the idea that Jesus is the suffering servant, and I agree with that. He is not specifically the suffering servant, but what he is a symbolic allegory for Israel, the righteous remnant that Jews will also tell others. And this is what is lost in translation between the church and Jews. There's something that Jesus said himself that I want everybody to take heed to, and that is what he said in Luke chapter 8, verse 18. And it says, "Take heed, therefore, how you hear. Unto whom it is given, there will be given more." He's speaking of understanding. Because depending on how you interpret these allegorical and parabolic statements in the Gospels will drastically change how one's message is given to the masses. The suffering servant is mentioned multiple times by the prophet Isaiah in a consistent theme starting in Isaiah chapter 40 on through the end of the chapter. What he is referring to is a righteous remnant of Israel that will suffer for the sake of their friends, their brethren, and things of that nature because of their faithfulness to God's laws and his commandments. Multiple times Isaiah refers to this righteous remnant as a collective whole of Israel. You may know this as a righteous remnant that will return, as spoken already, that will come back to the land. This is what Isaiah is referring to. So to take this one chapter and attribute it to one person is not accurate. You have to take this in proper context, because if one only reads Isaiah chapter 53, then they will look at this and say, see, this is Jesus. See, this is Yeshua. The problem is you have to take the whole message and apply it and see that 8 other times previously before Isaiah chapter 53, Isaiah is referring to these people as a collective whole, Israel. So again, as Jesus said himself, take heed how you hear, because if you take these chapters, if you take these parables and apply them wrong, then it will change the whole message. And this is where we get doctrines that Paul protrudes from his letters and epistles. He takes these things out of context, and then what happens is he teaches these to the masses, to the Gentile audience, without a pretextual understanding of what is being told, and not seeing the allegories that are being mentioned here in these Gospels, and you get the wrong idea. So understand that I'm not Christian, I'm not anything of that nature, but so I want to bridge this gap. Understand that the Son of Man is Israel itself. It is not one single individual. Daniel Paul K., who I've met on Facebook, does a great book, and he does a great job of protruding the idea that Israel is simply the Son of Man as a whole. And that's true. When we see Jesus suffering at the hands of his fellow spiritual leaders at the time, the Pharisees, as they show in the book, he's being crucified and he's suffering for the sake of his own obedience to God's laws and commands. This is symbolic of what the righteous remnant of Israel right now is going through. We have to suffer these things at the hands of our spiritual leaders, friends, family, whoever it may be, because of our faithfulness to the God of Israel and his laws and commands. At the time that Jesus was being shown in these Gospels, the Pharisees of his day had veered away from God's commands and his laws. This is why he was persecuted so much. This is why he was hated so much. And this is why they ended up putting him to death, because he was faithful to this covenant. This is the same thing that the righteous remnant of Israel, spoken of in Isaiah chapter 40, all the way through the end in 66, is suffering today. It is a picture, it is an allegory that is being shown that we have to suffer just as he did. And it is our persecutors that we are suffering for, just as he did. We are not dying for them, we are not dying for these people, but symbolically we are. We are being chastened so that we would be coming out of this as a righteous remnant for God's glory and for the sake of the world. And we suffer willingly right now, because just like a diamond is only a diamond because it's able to withstand the stress, so is this suffering going on right now. We have to be able to be profitable for use. And David said it many times that it is good that I've been afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. And before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I've kept your word. So understand that chastening is a good thing by God. Whom God loves, he chastens. And we're suffering horribly for it right now. But understand it's for the greater good. It's for the greater good of a collective whole for the world. Now, Jesus even alludes to this allegory. that the Son of Man is Israel as a collective whole. He speaks of this many a times, and here's one example.
For as lightning that lighteth out of one part of the heaven shineth unto the other part of the heaven, so shall the Son of Man be in his day. But first he must suffer many things, and be rejected of his generation. Before all these they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, and it shall turn to you for a testimony. Settle it therefore in your hearts, and do not meditate before what ye shall answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries shall not be able to gainsay nor resist.
Understand that without the story and the gospel of Jesus itself, none of this suffering could really go on. It is because of him and his name that we are actually suffering right now. It works for both sides. People are either worshiping Jesus and forsaking the laws that God gave, or they are suffering as Jesus and keeping God's laws and commands just as he did. It's one or the other. And because people have lost this understanding of what Jesus did and how he walked, then people do not see and they don't understand why someone would not worship Jesus as they are. All of this comes together because of this story, because of these gospels, because of his name. So when he says you're suffering from my name's sake, it's because of him that we're suffering. To our friends and family, we look like Judas. We look like a betrayer, as I've mentioned in other videos. That's what this looks like on the outside without understanding what's really going on.
He is despised and rejected of man, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and Jehovah hath laid on him the iniquity of us all.
The suffering servant is spoken of in detail in this chapter, Isaiah 53, and this is the main chapter that many will use to give authority that Jesus is this suffering servant. And they don't see that this suffering, this torment that's going on is a symbolic or allegorical statement being shown. Just like he was hated, we are hated. The spiritual leaders of that time, you see Jesus rebuking because they've all gone away and created their own commandments that God had not given them. So God uses this righteous remnant of Israel to suffer for their sake. And we suffer so that in the end, the world might live because of the chastening that we've gone through, so that God will give a righteous remnant in Israel to lead the world in righteousness. Because without chastening, it's hard to grow. You know, it's like weightlifting. When I was weightlifting, every time that I would lift weights, you'd get sore. You'd get really sore after a good workout. But you know what? After that pain, you knew that those muscles were going to grow. It's the same thing when God chastens you and puts you through the storm, puts you through the fire. When you come out of that, you become a diamond. When you come out of that, you're able to grow. There's no difference between weightlifting like that than it is with God's chastening with us. Every time we fall, we get back up and we grow. All this chastening and refining that he's doing is for his glory, so that he would have a righteous remnant to show Jacob, to show Abraham that they wouldn't be ashamed in that day. And that through this righteous remnant and suffering for our own friends or family that are persecuting us, and the spiritual leaders of today that are persecuting us for being faithful to God's laws and covenant, in the end, we'll be able to teach others righteousness, and we'll forgive our tormentors and those that are persecuting us.
Isaiah 53:10, Yet it pleased Jehovah to bruise him, he hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Jehovah shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors.
So many will remember when Jesus was actually on the cross, you saw him being persecuted and being ridiculed by his own friends, his family, things of that nature. And his response was simply, forgive them. They know not what they do. They don't know any better. And this is the same thing that we're saying today. We make intercession and we just say, forgive them, Father. They know not what they do. And this is the symbolism that you're going to find in Isaiah 53. It's consistent with what Isaiah's message is all along, and that is that the suffering servant is Israel itself. God says that this righteous remnant will be called righteous and holy. Take a look.
The people also shall be all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, that I may be glorified. And it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion and he that remaineth in Jerusalem shall be called holy, even every one that is written among the living in Jerusalem.
So this suffering, all this pain and all this sorrow, we suffer it for his glory, because God needs a righteous remnant that will walk in his laws that we can glorify him in. This is what the son is. This is what Israel is. God says his son is Israel. Exodus 4:22 says, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. So Israel, his son, has to suffer so that in the end, the world would learn righteousness through their chastening. Now, understand, and I'll show you these verses on the screen, that God says many times, multiple times, that Israel is the servant. Israel is the suffering servant. He says it many times. Thou, Israel, art my servant, and my servant whom I have chosen. Remember these, O Jacob and Israel. I have formed thee. Thou art my servant, Israel. You will not be forgotten of me. Thou art my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Is it a light thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved of Israel? I will also give thee a light to the Gentiles, that you may be a salvation unto the end of the earth. So see here that Isaiah has already spoken numerous times before Isaiah chapter 53 that this righteous remnant is Israel, and they're just chosen to be a light to the Gentiles, and they suffer during this time because God is chastening us to bring us into the fold back to the land of Israel. And God says in the end of this, God says that Abraham and Jacob, our forefathers, they're not going to be ashamed when they see the work of God's hands in his planting.
Therefore thus saith Jehovah, who redeemed Abraham concerning the house of Jacob, Jacob shall not be ashamed, neither shall his face now wax pale. When he seeth his children, the work of my hands, in the midst of him, they shall sanctify my name, and sanctify the Holy One of Jacob, and shall fear the God of Israel.
So in that day, our persecutors, the kings of the earth as it's referred to, these are just the spiritual leaders of that day. They'll be shocked when they see this hated remnant, the people that they once shamed and the people that they once looked at and wagged their heads. They thought that we were stricken of God, or in some cases, many thought that we were crazy. It's all for this purpose.
Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of Jehovah revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form or comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He's despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, and acquainted him with grief. And we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not.
Who would have believed it? These people that we looked at before in shame and disgust, who would have thought that God would use this small people for his glory? Who would have thought that they were suffering for our sake? This is what the nations and the people will say at that time. We scorned this person, we shamed this person, and we didn't realize that it was for our sake that he was suffering all these things. Because all we like sheep have gone astray, and God has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This righteous remnant, this group, the remnant of Israel, is suffering these things for this purpose. So it's not that we literally die for the sins of our brothers and sisters that have gone wayward away from God's commandments and laws. It's symbolic in nature that we're suffering these things. Because of the chastening that we're going through, God will use us after he's gone and placed us through the fire, that we'd be able to teach the nations. That's all. And this symbolism, this allegorical context, is lost in translation between what the Gospels present and what Paul preaches. These things are hidden. Now again, I'm not Christian, but I want to point out truth when truth is due. Jesus died because the hypocritical leaders and the kings at that time hated him for the doctrines that he stood for, and that was proper doctrine in keeping God's commandments and laws. He rebuked the elders at the time that were veering away from God's commandments and adding things to them, such as washing the hands and making it a commandment, so they put him to death. They didn't like his teaching because it contradicted what they were already teaching other people.
Ready, Jean? Now you write on this paper what I have taken from you. What have you lost? Write it! Write it! Yeah. Congratulations.
And it's the same today, just as the prophets before us suffered because they were faithful to the God of Israel and were zealous concerning his laws, just as Elijah did in his day, we do the same. And I would also add that not that a man can die for the sins of another person or atone or anything of that nature. God makes it very clear in Ezekiel 18 that a man cannot die for another person's sins, that we are all responsible for our own sins. But because of this story of Jesus, because of this gospel, it did produce a righteous remnant that would go through this persecution. Without this story, there's no persecution that we suffer today. It's because of him and his name in this story, and because we don't worship Jesus, but rather that we actually worship the God of Israel, Jehovah, and bring glory to his name through obedience to his laws and his commandments, just as he did, that we're hated for it and we're persecuted for it. See the bigger picture of what's going on. This is God's plan all along. And remember, Jesus said something very true also, and that is, a prophet is not without honor except in his own house and of his own kin. How many of us can attest to that statement today? So again, I don't like labels. I always state that in these videos. I'm not a Christian. I don't worship Jesus. I worship Jehovah and keep his covenant. And whenever somebody asks me what I am, I don't like labels, but what I am is Israel, because God said that if you keep my commandments and obey my voice, I'll make you a peculiar people unto me, and I'll make you a nation of priests. I'll make you a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We are a nation. We are a people that is dedicated to the covenant that God gave us at Mount Sinai. That's all. That's what united our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All they did was obey God. That's it. Everything else, if you want to label them, that's up to you. But understand that the only label that we're concerned with is that of Israel, because God says that if you keep my commandments and do my statutes, you will be a holy nation. So all we're supposed to do is just bear glory to his name, and the only way to do that is by keeping his commandments and statutes. We're supposed to be witnesses to let all the world know that Jehovah is God, there is none else. And because our friends, our family, and others have veered away from these commandments and these principles that we hold high, this is why we suffer. This is why we go through this time. And this is why we're rejected in this generation. But it's all for a greater purpose. So I hope this video was a help. I hope this sheds light on the bigger picture, and that is that Israel itself is the suffering servant, and that Jesus in the parables is just simply an allegory and a picture of this righteous remnant of what they will suffer. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you again on another video.